Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome you all to the second edition, the second webinar as part of Dr. Coleman's webinar series with us. So, last time I'm sure you had a very, enriching experience with, while attending this. We had a tremendous number of questions. I believe, even we shared some of the feedback with Darren as well. So this webinar, is themed on building experiences on solid foundations with brand experience essentials. Our faculty, Dr. Coleman, who's spent so much of his time, is with us, and it's over to him now.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to deliver the second in a three-part series on building brand experiences. The idea that you build experiences to facilitate relevance and drive long-term brand performance. So the objectives for today's webinar, there's a few that I want to cover off. First, to recap on the first webinar so we can see where we've come from so far, and then introduce the idea of the brand experience essentials. So this relates to brand values, brand essence, brand promise, brand positioning, and brand personality. And these are key intangible brand assets that experiences are built upon. So we'll look at these in a bit more detail today. And more importantly, we'll be building on last week's session to see how the brand experience essentials intersect with the brand experience environment. So the idea being that you define and develop your brand experience essentials in the context of the brand experience environment to facilitate more relevant brand experiences being built. So a recap on the first week and the journey that we've started together. So the journey so far, last week we looked at the brand experience environment, and this related to the context that brands are built within. I believe that Jay has kindly shared table 1. So this is the questions that relate to the brand experience environment. Today we're going to move on to the brand experience essentials. So these are the building blocks of brand experiences, the foundations that brand experiences are built upon. And I believe that Jay has also kindly shared table 2. And what this does is outline some of the questions that you should be asking yourself so that you can think about how your brand, when it's defined, intersects with the brand experience environment to facilitate the definition and development of a more relevant brand, and so more relevant brand experiences. So today we'll be looking at how the brand experience environment and brand experience enablers, brand experience environment and brand experience essentials intersect. And then next week, the third and final webinar, we'll look at how you can bring your brand experience enablers to life through design, communications, etc. And we'll also be looking at measurement. So in terms of a quick recap, last week we looked at the brand experience environment. This is the context that your brand is built within. So these are the key factors that you need to be mindful of when it comes to defining and developing your brand. And as a result of thinking about defining and developing your brand in the context of the brand experience environment, that will facilitate the development of a more relevant brand. So there were 4 elements in the brand experience environment, and there were topics within each element. So for example, we had understanding your stakeholders, and we looked last week at profiling stakeholders with Standard Charter in Indonesia being an example. Then we looked at the idea of fine-tuning your perspective, and we looked at the importance of value and the importance of competing through value, and that there will always be someone that can say they can do it cheaper, but it's a case of understanding the unique value you deliver into the market. Then we looked at the idea of considering the mechanics of delivery, and the one topic within considering the mechanics of delivery was we looked at emotion and the importance of the limbic system and how it's the emotion that someone feels when they make a choice. That's the key element. And we looked at how there was some research from Forrester that showed how the importance of emotion drove performance by a factor of 1.5 to the cognitive rational thought processes. And we looked at a couple of really interesting examples there, All Out, Stand By Tough Mums and Marigold startup in the context of entrepreneurship, which showed how the brand was being empathetic. So you can see how these brands are pulling the emotional levers increasingly these days. Then finally, we looked at the idea of adopting a data-driven approach. So this was about using robust statistical models that help you adopt a more scientific approach to building brand experiences. We looked at an example from the university sector where we used a method called multidimensional unfolding to understand objectively how the brands were positioned in the market. And then another way that we used robust statistics was to identify the values that drove performance metrics for an investment bank. So the days of defining and developing a brand based on personal opinion and anecdote have long gone. Powerful brands are built and informed based on robust insights. But at the same time, it's also important to incorporate some qualitative insights into your brand building processes because they can deliver rich and contextual insights that quantitative analysis simply can't do. So last week, we looked at the brand experience environment. This is the context that brands are defined and developed within so that they're not developed in a vacuum. And this is the second part that we'll be looking at today. We're going to look at the brand experience essentials: values, essence, promise, positioning, and personality. And in summary, the objective of today is to firstly help you understand these intangible assets in more practical terms, but think about how they intersect with the brand experience environment. So for example, when you're defining values, they need to be relevant to your stakeholders. When you're defining values, you need to think about, can you offer them transparently? If people challenge your values, are you happy to be exposed? So it's about how the brand experience essentials are defined and developed in the context of the environment to facilitate the development of a more relevant brand. So that's what we'll be looking at today. So the brand experience essentials, these are key intangible brand assets that organizations develop. They're the foundations that brand experiences are built upon. So these are really the cornerstones of how you build brand experiences. If you don't have well-defined and developed brand experience essentials, you do not have a brand. They provide guidance, focus, and structure for building consistent experiences at scale. So if one of your values is to be caring, then when it comes to bringing that value of being caring to life through design, communications, or behaviour, you have a guiding principle that can focus creative briefs, activations, etc., and structure your approach at scale. Without clearly defined and developed brand experience essentials, you're a bit like a ship sailing without focus. You'll just be drifting. So by thinking about the brand experience essentials in the context of the brand experience environment, then you'll be well placed to build experiences on a brand that's more relevant. So unfortunately in branding, there's lots of jargon. And this actually isn't a picture of me, but sometimes when I'm in meetings, I do feel like banging my head against the wall because there's there's no quicker way to alienate senior executives than by using lots of jargon. So brand is plagued with jargon, and I firmly believe this prevents and inhibits brand being understood and accepted in the boardroom. So I want to try and explain some of these terms, just practically speaking. So brand values, in simplistic, practical terms, this is how you would describe your brand in 4 or 5 words. So for example, we had a client that was an outdoor recreational brand, a bit like North Face or Patagonia, if you will. And the values were to be inspiring, dependable, driven, and down to earth. So actually, instead of talking about brand values, they used to just say, we describe our brand as inspiring, dependable, driven, and down to earth. It makes the brand far more accessible. Secondly, we've got the idea of brand essence. So this is, if you were asked to sum up your brand in 2 or 3 words, what would you say it's all about? So this brand was all about active outdoor excellence. The promise relates to the bundle of benefits, not features you deliver. Regrettably, most brands focus on talking about features in the marketplace. Customers and other stakeholders don't care about features, they care about the benefits derived from features. So, all of our clothes are made from natural fabric, which means that they're extremely lightweight and warm. As a customer, do I really care about the fact that they're from natural fabric? Possibly not to a large extent, but the fact they're lightweight and warm, that's a benefit derived from the feature which delivers value to me. Brand positioning can be massively overcomplicated. I'd encourage you to keep things simple. Brand positioning is nothing more, nothing less than thinking about how you are different from your main competitors. So this brand was, they believed outdoor and competitive activities can be enjoyed by everyone. Everyone can compete. The brand was accessible. And the personality was, if you were to describe the brand as a person, who would they be? So in this context, it was actually a well-known athlete in the UK and Western Europe, Jessica Ennis-Hill. So in the first column, we've got the more formal language of brand experience essentials. But as you take this forward into your organisations, depending on who you're talking to, I'd encourage you to tone down the brand jargon and just use everyday accessible language. If you start talking about brand values to someone in strategy, you'll probably see their eyes rolling. But if you start saying, we describe our brand in 4 or 5 words in this way, you'll engage them in far more practical terms. So this is an example of Bank of Singapore. And Bank of Singapore is quite niche. Private banks, deals with high net worth individuals. But the communications piece that they've put together here gives you a clue about what their brand values are.
You've come this far, but you'll never forget what got you here in the first place. Like you, we believe in the timeless value of hard work. Bank of Singapore, building on your values.
So that's a really beautiful piece of brand communications. And what they're doing is very cleverly showing how they are a bank for people that have got money. The guy's got a chauffeur, he's driving in a Bentley, being driven in a Bentley, but he's down to earth. He's old money, he's not a snob. He's not too proud to get out, help the driver and get his hands dirty. And that's symptomatic of the way in which Bank of Singapore conducts itself. Yes, it's for wealthy people, but it's for people that are quite down to earth and accessible. And they've used that campaign extensively. This was an example that was slightly closer to home from Marico, and they set up digital classrooms. And I think the goal here was in line with NIHA's commitment towards building a progressive society by contributing towards children's education. So this activity implies values of being caring, considerate, progressive, forward-thinking, empathetic, and understanding the challenges that are being faced by children in these rural areas. So they've moved beyond the product and they're thinking about values wrapped around the product that then are relevant to certain customers and, I would imagine, stakeholders and investors. So this was an example of a company that has communicated their values as a means of guiding the experiences they build, and the values are a mechanism for attracting key stakeholders. So brand essence is how you would describe your brand in 2 or 3 words. Our brand is all about. And Professor Kevin Lane Keller shared a really simple but very effective tool where you think about an emotional modifier as an adjective, a descriptive modifier an adjective, and a brand function as a noun. So Nike is all about authentic athletic performance. Disney is all about fun family entertainment. And this is powerful because once you understand the brand essence, then you've got parameters, scope, that delimit the goods, services and experiences that you should and shouldn't put under your brand. So for example, Nike is all about authentic athletic performance. I have no idea why Nike hasn't moved into performance centres, tennis academies, football academies, etc., golfing academies. If Nike was to do that and you walked into a tennis academy, you wouldn't see kids sitting around on a sofa drinking a can of Coca-Cola. They'd be running for that last point, they'd be training, they'd be getting ready because it would be all about authentic athletic performance. Similarly, Disney is all about fun family entertainment. There's no reason why, with that brand essence, Disney couldn't open a chain of themed restaurants that are all about fun family entertainment. So you walk in and Mickey Mouse greets you and then the 7 Dwarfs serve you, all this type of thing. And this is powerful because it's the intangible asset where the value resides and the brand is the intangible asset. So if we look at how the composition of the S&P 500 has changed between 75 and 2015, you can see that the relationship has inversed. During that time, the value has moved from tangible assets to intangible assets. This is why IBM got out of making computers. They understand the knowledge is in intangible assets. This is why Apple is increasingly moving into service-based propositions with TV, streaming, etc. So the point here is emotion resides in brands, and brands, when they connect at an emotional level, deliver value to customers, and that's when they'll pay price premiums. So the next point was talking about brand personality. And brand personality capitalizes on humans' natural tendency to make non-living things living. A classic example was the car Herbie, which was a VW Beetle, but it had a fun-loving, cheeky, friendly personality. Mini have done this. At the end of the day, a Mini is metal on 4 wheels and a chassis, but it's got a friendly, fun, urban type of personality that attracts certain customers. And that personality is powerful because it becomes a means of self-expression. I drive a Mini, it says this about me. So what happens here is that by using personality, we're making the brand less abstract and more tangible. It means we can relate to the brand in emotional terms. So the Marlboro Man, masculine, macho, that's what the brand is all about. And they've even moved into clothing over the years. But most importantly, we express our personality through the brand. Kate Moss pretty much saved Burberry, along with Tom Ford doing the design when he moved over from Gucci. But at that time, Burberry was having real difficulties. In a similar manner to one of their main competitors, Aquascutum, Burberry engaged with Kate Moss, who was edgy, young. She had things going on in her life that made her more relevant and engaging to the target customer. It gave the brand more relevance instead of being a dull, stuffy, snobbish British brand. If you compare that with Aquascutum, they've gone out of business. So they use the brand personality of Kate Moss very effectively to make their brand more relevant and relatable to the so-called millennial generation. The next point relates very much to India. And I'm aware of the value of celebrity endorsement in India, but just keep your eye on this guy here, Virat. So clearly, Mr. Kohli is on fire. His value for brands has grown considerably in the last 4 years. So there's something about his personality, his values, what he stands for, what he believes in, that resonates with a number of target markets. So brands are using his brand as a mechanism for connecting with customers in emotional and relevant terms, just as Burberry used Kate Moss. So that's why we give brands personality, because it means that we can relate to a brand in more emotional terms through the personality of the individual associated with the brand. So another element within the brand experience environment is the brand promise. So these are the benefits that you deliver. But there's a really easy way to extract benefits from features. You talk about the feature, which means that benefit. So for example, somebody may say, well, I speak Mandarin Chinese. So what? Well, I speak Mandarin Chinese. Excuse me. I speak Mandarin Chinese, which means that I can translate, I can interpret, I can accompany you on business trips, etc. One sum or all of those benefits will be relevant to set stakeholders. So by focusing on features, you're not delivering value because the value lies in the benefit, and also one feature can deliver multiple benefits. So by focusing on features, you're shortchanging yourself. So this is an example of how a brand emergency talked about their product.
When you feel good, no one is immune. Emergency has more vitamin C than 10 oranges, plus other antioxidants and electrolytes, to help you come down with a serious case of healthy. Emergency, making healthy contagious.
So that's one way that you could communicate a product brand. I do wonder how many people understand what antioxidants are, what they do. Similarly, electrolytes, what are they and what do they do? So it could be argued that the people at Emergency here are focused on the features as opposed to the benefits. Another option that they could have followed was to talk about electrolytes, which means that you will hydrate your body, and that in its turn can rebuild damaged tissues. So rebuilding damaged tissues could appeal to a variety of segments. So in many ways, it could be contended that Emergency here have talked about features that not many customers will possibly understand in terms of practical benefits delivered. You see this with shampoo brands, and they're talking about the molecular structure of the brands, etc. And sometimes I'm at a loss as to why they're doing that, because they're talking about the feature as opposed to the benefit derived from that feature. So this was a really lovely example from Lifebuoy, and a key part of their brand promise was about protecting effectively from germs. But what they did with the infection alert system was created an absolutely fantastic system to prevent communicable diseases. So they used big data and predictive analytics to understand when there was going to be a point of inflection regarding a disease. And at that point, it triggered members of the team to call people in areas that were at risk of exposure to encourage them to wash their hands in a certain way so that communicable disease didn't spread. So when it comes to positioning, I'd encourage you not to overcomplicate things. Positioning is about associations in memory. So the brain works in a very similar way to a 3D map. So what we've got here is we've got lumps within the brain, and then we've got roads between the brains. Yeah? So the nodes are the lumps within the brain, and the synapses are the roads, the connections between the brain, and it's the repetition of communications that results in the connections between the nodes being reinforced by the synapses. That's very similar to walking up and down a garden path over the grass. At first, that connection between one end and the other won't be clear, but if you keep walking up and down that garden, the grass will wear out and you'll see the path. That is why big, fast-moving consumer brands like the Coca-Colas of this world spend an awful lot of money on repetitive advertising to create the association in memory. Yeah. Neuroscientists say when it becomes fired, it becomes wired, with the idea being that you fire the neurons between the various parts of the brain, and that facilitates the memory. So this was an example from the Indian market where Vodafone were under threat from a new entrant in 2016 called Jio. And what happened is they offered 4G for free for a year, so they were commoditizing the technology. So what Vodafone looked to do was fight back by looking at a data-strong network that delivered value for data-hungry applications. And this is one example of a really, really nice piece of communications they did.
ผมต้องการเค้กข้าวแล้ววองกาย่าซัมบ้าซึ่งมันอร่อยมาก
What's the problem?
คือผมต้องการเค้กข้าวแล้ววองกาย่าซัมบ้า
Are you Chinese?
ไทย
Repeat.
ผมต้องการวองกาย่าซัมบ้า
Asha, he wants Bengal sambar.
No.
Now I understood. You should have told me earlier.
So there's an example of how a global brand didn't just position but reposition 4G around delivering relevant value for data-intensive applications. And in 5 months, Vodafone won back all of the customers they lost. So it was about creating the association in memory between Vodafone and 4G, that it wasn't just about data, but it was about Vodafone was the brand that could help you with data-intensive applications. So it was very much about quality of service as opposed to quantity of service. And that's where they felt they could get one up on Jio. This is an example of a niche Dutch bank that only invests in socially responsible funds.
Imagine two banks. Both employ helpful people who deal with your questions, and both are financially sound. At each bank, you can save regularly, earn interest, and of course, manage your account online. Only one bank does it differently. This bank only invests in things which are good for both people and the planet. Things like renewable energy, organic farming, and ecological development. This bank invests in businesses that want to make a healthy profit and want to make a positive difference to society. This bank finances those businesses only with money from their depositors and investors. So the money those people save is invested back into the society they live in. It's actually very simple. Both savers and investors help to build a better, more sustainable world. That one bank is us. Follow your heart, use your head. Triodos Bank.
So when you think about this positioning, it's far more relevant to stakeholders today. It has emotional appeal, and they'll have planned this based on a data-driven approach. So you can see how competing in those terms is far more relevant in today's world. They're not talking about interest rates, number of ATMs, number of branches. They're all points of parity. They're focused on an emotionally relevant point of difference. And they can do that credibly and authentically because it's key. It's an integral part of how they position their brand. And you see mainstream brands trying to move into this more ethical space. And it's just not washing with consumers these days because with social, there's nowhere to hide. They can assess the authenticity of a brand's claims very quickly these days And if you take the moral high ground and you don't deliver, you'll be strung out. You really will. So this was an example of positioning as one of the brand experience essentials. So now, when we try and connect everything, when we look at values, essence, promise, positioning, personality, the key point is to think about how your values connect with stakeholders. So, for example, if we think of stakeholders and profiling last week, you should be thinking, well, how confident are we that our values will resonate with stakeholders? Over here, when you think about values and the perspective, we could think about, well, how comfortable are we with our values, and that how can we engage with our customers transparently? So if we are saying that our brand is caring, but then we don't deliver on that value, there'll be problems. For example, when you think about values and emotion, how emotionally relevant are those values to our stakeholders? Can our stakeholders co-create those values with us and bring them to life? Can we deliver those values across all of our channels? So what happens is we think about how values intersect with stakeholders, fine-tuning your perspective, delivery, data, and that provides a way in which you can start to build values that are going to be more relevant because they're plugged in to the brand experience environment. Similarly, your essence, how relevant is it to stakeholders? Can you fine-tune your perspective? Will it be transparent? Is it about value, not price? And then we go around this process again. When you think about the promise, the benefits you deliver, are they relevant to your stakeholders? Can you be transparent about delivering that promise? Is it focused on value, not price? Is it emotional? Can it be co-created? Can you deliver that promise across all of your channels? Then we think about positioning. Is it relevant to your stakeholders? Can you deliver against the expectations that the positioning creates? So again, we go round this process systematically, and we think then about personality. How relevant is it to stakeholders? Think about fine-tuning your perspective, the mechanics of delivery, and which personality is relevant based on data. So what we've got here is the second stage of the three-step process for building brand experiences. Firstly, we understand the context, the brand experience environment. And these are the factors that are driving markets today. Then, when it comes to building and defining and developing our brand, values, essence, promise, positioning, personality, we need to come up for air and define our values, define our essence, promise, positioning, personality in the context of these four elements. If you don't, you're in danger of defining and developing a brand in a vacuum. And if you define and develop a brand in a vacuum, it will have no contextual relevance. And we see this time and time again, that brands are defined and developed based on personal opinion and anecdote. They're severely lacking in relevance because they're not plugged into the brand experience environment. So that's how these two areas intersect. Some elements of the environment will be more or less relevant to certain stakeholders and to certain brands. And whilst I've started on values, essence, promise, positioning, personality, hopefully you can see that these are holistic. So for example, the values that you have influence the positioning and the personality. The promise you have will be key to your essence. So branding is holistic, but for the purposes of building a holistic brand that sits together comfortably, we need to break it down into these pieces of values, essence, promise, positioning, personality. And then it should all fit together into one cohesive, intangible asset that is your brand. So the benefits of connecting the brand experience environment and brand experience essentials, sorry, that should be essentials, is that you'll build a relevant brand. So the idea is that your values, essence, promise, positioning, and personality are plugged in to the brand experience environment, so they'll be relevant to stakeholders. They'll fine-tune your perspective. They'll be informed by data, etc. So they mean that your brand will be aligned and more relevant with stakeholders because they're plugged in and dovetail with the brand experience environment. But regrettably, most brands are defined in a vacuum. So they don't connect a brand with the brand experience environment. And that's why they're not relevant. Because they've defined the brand and their head is in the sand, literally. And then when it comes to bringing the brand to life, they wonder why the communications or the design or the way their employees doesn't drive performance. Well, the reason being is because the brand isn't relevant to target customers and other stakeholders. So the brand experience blueprint solves this problem because it provides you with a practical and structured management tool that forces you to think about how you can define and develop a brand that's relevant to the context that brands are operating within today. So in terms of the journey that we're going on, this is what we've covered so far. Last week, we looked at the brand experience environment. This is the context that the brands are built within. So this is about stakeholders, data, fine-tuning your perspective, etc. These are the macro factors that are shaping brand experiences today. In the second session, we've looked at brand experience essentials. So these are intangible brand assets. These are the building blocks of brand experiences, and they need to be defined and developed in the context of the brand experience environment. So your values, when it comes to defining and developing them, they need to be relevant to stakeholders, customers, investors, local communities, your employees, etc. The values that you build, the choices that you make with regards to the values you build need to be informed by data. So last week, the example I gave of an investment bank, that was very much data driven with regards to the values that they selected in order to build their brand experiences. So it's really important that the brand experience essentials are defined and developed within the context of the brand experience environment, because if that doesn't happen, your brand will be defined in a vacuum and it will lack relevance. So the brand experience essentials are also powerful because they act as the building blocks for next week. So next week, we'll be looking at the brand experience enablers. This is employee behaviour, communications and design. So if one of your values is to be caring, then the way that your employees behave needs to be caring. Your communications needs to make it clear that you are caring. The design needs to make me feel as if you are a brand that's caring, because I can't touch the value of being caring, but I can interact with your employees' communications and design, and that gives me a clue that you're a caring brand. And if being caring is important to me, I'll be attracted to that brand's value, because then I can use the brand as a means of expression. So that's powerful. So that's how the enablers that we look at next week will connect with the essentials, but the essentials need to be defined and developed within the context of the brand experience environment. Or when it comes to the way your employees behave, communications and design, they'll be completely irrelevant. And we'll also next week look at measurement. So how to measure brand experiences based on cause and effect. So when I started today's webinar, I set myself 3 main objectives. I wanted to recap on the first webinar so you could understand the context for today. Secondly, to introduce the brand experience essentials, values, essence, promise, positioning, personality, but also to try to introduce these 5 intangible brand assets in more practical and tangible terms so that when you do come to talking about your brand with people outside the marketing department, you can talk about values in terms of 4 or 5 words that we'd use to describe our brand. If you start talking about values, essence, promise, position, personality, it's highly likely that people will disengage. And building brand experiences is everyone's job. So you need to engage with people through more practical and accessible language. And then the final point was to build a relevant brand by defining and developing brand experience essentials in the context of the brand experience environment. So the idea being that when it comes to defining and developing values, essence, promise, positioning, personality, you do that in the context of the brand experience environment so that the brand you define and develop isn't defined and developed in a vacuum that has no relevance to your stakeholders. So that's what I wanted to achieve today. There's a table that was issued last week. If you haven't had the chance to look at it, to think about how values intersect with the various parts of the brand experience environment. So these are the types of questions that you can ask systematically to challenge yourself to ensure that your values, essence, promise, positioning, personality are going to be relevant. And then next week, I think Jay is going to kindly send this table out, table 3. So this is where we think about how to bring your brand to life. So we'll look at how we use employee behaviour, communications and design to bring your brand, the brand experience essentials to life. So if your brand is caring, you need to be recruiting people that are caring. If your brand is bold, then you need to be recruiting people that are bold. Because if I engage with some communications that gets me thinking your brand is bold, and then I speak to someone in store, online, over the phone, and they're not bold, the brand experience falls apart. So a question that I've got, and if I use any of the answers in next week's 3rd and final webinar, I'll happily send you a copy of my book. So please email me an example of how one of your organization's brand experience essentials connect with the brand experience environment. So for example, some of your values are emotional. Your positioning has been based on robust data analysis. So if I use your example in next week's session, you'll be in with a chance of winning a copy of my book. So I'll be delighted to hear from you and incorporate some of the examples. So that's it for the second webinar, and we've got some time for some questions. There's my phone number and email if we don't manage to cover them now. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you very much, Darren. In fact, I've got a few questions over email. I'll just put the first to you. So there's this brand that you mentioned about brand personality, you know, the right choice for a brand personality that represents, you know, a brand itself. So, you know, there's a training institution here, since most Indian brands do not have a very high budget when it comes to, you know, endorsements by celebrities. How can brands be particularly, you know, wise when it comes to choosing a proper, you know, brand personality if it's not a celebrity and just, you know, someone who's not that popular? So how does any suggestions that you might have?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if anything, a lot of big brands are turning away from celebrities because they don't have the authenticity that everyday consumers can relate to. So my advice would be understand the stakeholder that you are building your brand for or your brands for, visualize them, and then try to find people that reflect that stakeholder and then incorporate them into your communications. So this is why micro-influencers are actually becoming increasingly popular, because these mainstream celebrities, people are finding it hard to identify with them. So please don't think that a brand personality needs to be a superstar cricket player or a big Bollywood star. It can actually be somebody from the public that the target customer or the stakeholders can identify with. So Yeah, no, that's a good question. It doesn't necessarily need to be a stakeholder. It doesn't necessarily need to be a personality that's a celebrity. It needs to be someone that the stakeholder can relate to, and that personality reflects the values of the brand and supports the positioning, etc.
In fact, Darren, you just mentioned the fact about micro-influencers. Very interestingly, a consumer durables brand, they've just posted a question where they had, influencers reviewing mobile phones, where a lot of Indian consumers make purchase decisions based on influencers standing for a brand, right? But then it so turned out that, there were questions raised over a course of a couple of years about some of these influencers actually being biased, paid reviews happening. So how does a brand actually overcome that once a brand moves away from celebrity endorsements into the realm of influencers?
Sorry, I lost you every now and again. So the question is, when you move from big time celebrities into micro influencers, how do you manage that process?
Yes, and apart from that, as an example, an Indian consumer durables company, they have a lot of influencers reviewing their product on YouTube, right? And unfortunately, what happened is, in some cases, these influencers later got, a widespread acknowledgement from the audience that, some of these reviews were paid and so on. So essentially, a brand is depending on an influencer, but due to the influencer's own reputation falling, the brand positioning gets impacted. So is there anything that a brand can do in this regard?
Use their marketing muscle and advertising budget to support the micro influencers through their channels. So the likes of Unilever and Procter and Gamble, etc., they have very powerful social footprints. So they can raise the profile of their micro influencers through their social channels. That's how I would go about doing that. Interestingly, in terms of the first point that you raised, in terms of influencers having agendas, I'm not sure how it works in India, but here in the UK, there's the law means that actually now you need to put a small pin on the communications to show that it's product placement. So yeah, they've tightened up the law. So it may well be, if that isn't the case in India, it may well be that may well be something that big FMCG brands want to consider doing as an initiative under their own steam.
Okay. So Darren, we have now a question from the B2B sector. So one organization which is a very well-known upcoming brand, they asked a question that, a lot of established brands, have turned to making extravagant promises when it comes to brands. So you mentioned the fact about brand promise as well. But how do upcoming, smaller players actually, counter the false commitments made by larger brands? That's a problem particularly common in our country, in India.
Yeah. The first thing I would say is never overpromise and underdeliver. It's a fatal marketing mistake. So firstly, never overpromise and underdeliver. And secondly, a way to combat that is through customer stories, customer testimonials, and user-generated content. So if customers are happy, they'll feel compelled to share their story, and I would openly encourage them to do that, because the story that comes from the customer is far more powerful than it comes from you. So for example, in a B2B context, when you have a customer that is very happy with your content, why not ask them to write a case study for you? Or better still, if they're speaking at a conference or they're presenting at an exhibition, why not ask them to demonstrate how they've used your product in a way that is co-branding presentation at conferences is also a really powerful thing to do. We've done that with a number of our bigger clients, and it's worked very well for us. So yeah, that's how I would approach that.
Darren, the next question is, you gave an example of an ethical bank and its positioning and the consequent emotional appeal. So, in the Indian market, a lot of brands, they actually position their brands based, position their brands on heritage, on ethics, a long-standing ethics and so on. However, the question pertains to a very discerning consumer. Most consumers nowadays, are going beyond pure ethics. They're focusing more on features. So how does a brand, go ahead and market itself to an audience that has gone beyond ethics alone?
I don't know a market where customers are interested in ethics or where ethics aren't powerful. So the way I would probably like to elevate the status of those types of brands is to position the brand as a means of self-expression. So what I mean by that is that because I'm banking with this bank, is this about me? Or I'm making a lifestyle choice about investing with this bank and using this bank because there's something about it. So I wouldn't focus on features because features commoditize an offer. But I would be looking at emotional and self-expressive benefits. So what does using this bank say about me? And then if you can find something that's unique about the brand being a means of ethical self-expression, you'll be in a powerful position. Because then if your competitor tries to copy you, they'll actually be doing you a favour because they'll be reinforcing your approach. Clarity yet. I don't know one market where ethics, in terms of a positioning strategy, is a powerful. It's become more of a hygiene factor, but that doesn't mean the point of difference has no value.
So Darren, there might be a bit of a slight audio lag at your end, but I do have few more questions as well. So I'll just narrate one. So, you mentioned, creating, you highlighted the brain and how brands can actually, utilize, that science to create powerful associative memories. But what about brands that are very commoditized, such as FMCG, such as roofing sheets? How does, a brand create specific powerful impulses, in consumers to actually go ahead and buy their product?
Yeah. So this is where we connect back to last week. And if you understand your stakeholders and you understand what's happening in their life, understand the challenges they're facing, etc., then you can start to think about emotional connections that are relevant to them. And then what you do is you position your brand in a way that's emotionally relevant. So this is where last week and this week start to connect. So the metal sheet example, if we use that, then you start to think about health and safety in construction, and maybe the quality of the product over generations and decades, if it's a family business. Then if you tie that in with an emotion of reliability and dependability, and that I can count on your brand, that moves you away from being a commodity. So you have to think about the emotional connection that is relevant to those stakeholders, and then consistently associate the brand with that emotional connection.
Darren, two more questions. One is how, it's a generic question, but you may share your views on this. How does an educational training organization which is into vocational training create the ideal set of brand values in essence for consumers or its customers?
Good question. So, practically speaking, the way that this works is that initially it requires you to conduct some exploratory focus group with key stakeholders and ask them the question, ideally, how would you describe a vocational training organisation in 4 or 5 words? Ask them that question. Don't ask them, what should our values be? Don't ask them, what should our ideal values be? Literally ask them, ideally, how would you describe a company like ours in 4 or 5 words? And do that a couple of times with various stakeholder groups. And after that exploratory stage, you will have a pool of words that are possible proxies, approximations for brand values. Then I would conduct a quantitative stage and identify which of those values drive performance metrics. So, for example, it may well be that revenues are a key metric. It may well be reputation is a key metric. So just as we did with our investment banking client last week, I would use a method similar to regression to identify which of those values drive performance metrics. So the first stage is exploratory and qualitative, and ask various stakeholder groups, in an ideal world, how would you describe a brand like ours? Then once you've got a pool of those words, you can use those in the statistical analysis as the independent variables, the drivers, however you want to call it, and then see which of those values drive performance metrics. And then what you've got is you've got a series of values that are relevant to stakeholders, but also drive performance. And that's how I would go about articulating values, and similarly, essence. So that's where defining values, essence, and these are the brand experience essentials plugs in with the data-driven approach. And senior executives will love this, because it won't be your word against theirs. It will be a case of, here's the data, this is what we've found out. Next question.
Yeah, Darren. So the last question pertains to, you so nicely showed us again, the brand experience blueprint towards the end, and also your question pertained to data. So in India, most brands focus excessively on consumer data to sort of make their branding decisions. But in the rush for this data-centric approach, which is one of the elements in the brand experience blueprint, aren't brands forgetting the other subtler elements, like you mentioned, values, essence, promise, and other things? So what's your advice to brands when it comes to only being driven on data and not focusing on other elements?
More speed, don't rush it, because you're throwing money after bad. So we see time and time again clients that have experienced, new clients that have experienced disappointing brand performance, and the first thing we do is go to their values, essence, promise, positioning, personality, and we say, how did you arrive at this brand? And most of them say, well, the executive team did an away day and we got an agency in and they facilitated a session, and then they all felt about right to us, and then off we went. And then you can say, well, that's where your problem lies, because you can see immediately that those values and that essence, etc., isn't relevant to any of the stakeholders. So I understand the need to get things done quickly, but that will give you long-term pain. So I go for the short-term pain for the long-term gain. And that's my approach. You have to hold firm and say, look, if we're going to do a job, we're going to do it properly, and we need to understand this, and we need to use data as best possible to ensure that the brand we define and develop is relevant to our stakeholders, etc. So I understand that, and literally earlier in the week, I've just come back from the Middle East, and that was immediately the problem. immediately the problem. So it's not just small companies that make this mistake, it's big, surprisingly big companies make this mistake as well. So that advice I just gave you about qualitative, quantitative, and then ideally some qualitative to define your brand, it's time and money well spent, it really is. Because otherwise people will dive into activations and big advertising campaigns, and the values won't be relevant to a stakeholder, or the positioning won't be based on data, and then it's just your guess is as good as mine as to whether it would work. So I understand the challenge, but I would advise taking your time. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, Darren, so that's all we have for now. And again, thank you for joining in. I know you've had a very hectic week. You mentioned you were in the Middle East, but you still found time for such a fascinating insight into the world of brands. On behalf of the audience, on behalf of CII, again, thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, next week Dr. Coleman would again join us for the third and final webinar. I would request you to share any questions that you have with him, as he so kindly has decided to share a book that he's authored with questioners whose questions he incorporates into his presentation. Darren, anything you have to say before we conclude, please?
No, just once again, and thank you for people who have attended. And if you have any questions, please contact me directly or direct them to Jay, and I'll be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Darren. See you on Friday.
Have a great weekend. Goodbye, everyone.
You too. Goodbye. Goodbye. See you, everyone.